by the previous speaker, finance should follow development, not otherwise. Meaning that first and foremost, every country should assess what exactly are the challenges that they need to address in the context of their particular profile and their situation. They need to develop a comprehensive action plan. It can be NDC. NDC, of course, can be complemented by the other documents. And then once they would have thought through what they need to do, what are their challenges, and what is their final objective, then they could develop what we often refer to as integrated financing framework, which would summarize and sort different policy actions and investments needed to implement this strategy that could be supported either by public finance, by private finance, or by the international financial assistance that can be provided by the MDBs, DFIs, or bilateral agencies. So that's the first point that I really would like to leave with all of you. Finance follows development, not otherwise. My second point is that the world of the climate finance is very complex and anything but homogeneous. Depending on the situation that the country is facing, solutions would be very different. In case majority of countries' emission is coming from the energy, from the coal plants, our focus would be on the actions supporting energy transition, which would require a particular set of actions. In case we are more focused on the challenges related to adaptation and to nature-based solutions, which is the case for many Latin American countries, then our financial and policy solutions would be very different. The type of policies and type of finance required to replace the coal plant would be very different from the type and combination of policies and finance required to protect forests, to enable sustainable agriculture, to enable the reforestation of and restoration of degraded lands. So that's the second point that I would like to make. Don't think that whatever is the fancy financial innovation of the day that everybody is talking about is the one that is going to fit for you. You really need to first understand what is that you are doing and what would be your good fit. So within this context and with 3 minutes that I have left, I would like to highlight a few interesting financial innovation instruments that we see now making waves, so to speak. So first, at the level of the capital markets, we see continued development and consolidation of the guidelines and methodologies targeting financial sector. As Rodrigo said, there is much focus on development of the green taxonomies. We also now have the first global standards focused on the disclosure related to the climate. And we have the increasing body of guidance on how climate-related risks could be incorporated in the assessment scenarios, supervision scenarios that are used by the financial sector. So we see the consolidation of the tools and methodologies that allow together to green the financial sector. And the 3 key parts here are methodologies to assess and to incorporate risks in the supervision, in the planning process for financial sector. Second is taxonomies, and third are disclosures. In terms of the sovereign finance, we see very interesting developments related to the long-term result-based finance. So, of course, we know that Latin America was the region which offered the first sustainability-linked sovereign bonds by Chile and Uruguay. And that really opened the floodgate of innovation, I would say. I'm very proud that the World Bank is now piloting the sustainability-linked feature in our own loan to Uruguay. There is a lot of interest that is coming from different countries to this particular mechanism, which, if you think about it, allows you to reward the KPIs, the results that take longer period to mature. In case of the sustainability-linked bonds and our upcoming loan for Uruguay, the option for interest rate buy down kicks in a few years into the implementation of the project, because that's how long it takes to actually get to the impact and to results. We see a very strong global debate focused on the nexus of debt and climate. There have been a few transactions which piloted debt for nature swaps. Once again, majority of these transactions, with one exception, were in Latin America, which is very interesting. And now we are doing our own assessment as to what would constitute a good approach to debt for nature swaps, to have a more clear guidance to MDBs, markets, and other sectors. There is continued focus on the use of proceeds, on the better use of the use of proceeds thematic bonds that would help to target climate change with a very well-established practices by sovereign issuers. And of course, Chile stands out in this field because I think that they were there before anybody else. Interestingly, now we see also the shift from purely green-focused thematic bonds to social-focused bonds. Finally, in the area of private finance, and I see I have 1 minute left. So in the area of private finance, there is much talk about the private capital mobilization and wide acknowledgement that we cannot close the climate finance gap without bringing in the private sector. Solutions for private capital mobilization linked to industry, to energy transition would be very different from the ones linked to the nature-based solutions. What we see is that while solutions to mobilize private capital for energy transition, for decommissioning of the coal plants, for construction of the renewable energy plants are becoming much better defined, with clear understanding what concessionality is required, how the blended finance models will look like. Nature part of this debate has been lagging behind. And we are now working jointly with our colleagues from the Inter-American Development Bank. The World Bank and IDB have the Memorandum of Understanding. We are working together on the broad set of issues related to Amazon, where we also would be looking at designing the blended finance solutions and models for private capital mobilization, which will specifically fit the nature-based solutions. Think about forests, think about sustainable agriculture, think about oceans. So to conclude, much is going on. This field is evolving very fast. We see incredible creativity. And I did not even speak about the disaster risk management and very interesting issues that have been coming out of the Caribbean, just because I don't have enough time. But I think that this discussion today is just the beginning. We need to do more. We need to consolidate our thinking, and we need to come up with the solutions that could be applied across the region, and which our high-level representatives, would it be MDBs, would it be governments, would it be private sector voices, could consistently put forward in different fora. I think that we think that the initiative of the Ministers of Finance, which was just mentioned by Rodrigo, is an absolutely great start. This would be an excellent forum to bring these discussions together and to give them more scale and more capacity to enact change. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Svetlana, for your insights. And it's quite interesting to to see the importance of this kind of financial assessment, tailor-made for countries, and action plans according to the sector, and how we can establish integrated national financing frameworks, considering public and private finance, using innovative approach for thematic bonds. We are kind of leading this process globally with Chile and Uruguay, and I'm proudly to share with you that UNDP, together with IDB, we have supported Uruguay to structure the frame, the SPO, and also the issuance of this very innovative bond in Uruguay, but also to consider public finance innovation, but carbon finance in this kind of strategy, and blended finance, as mentioned before by Svetlana, innovative blended finance instruments by economy, but also the risking instruments. It's really, really important to include in this process. So thank you very much, Svetlana. A continuación tenemos...
So following, we have Alejandro Noguera, facilitator of the climate finance in the NDC Alliance in the National Department of Planning of Colombia. Alejandro is a graduate in international relations with specialized in finance. He is a facilitator of the NDC partnership project with a focus on financial instruments and priority areas for Align NDC of Colombia. Alejandro, welcome. Our question for you is in relation to where do you see the role of the tax incentives in the strategies of climate financing of Colombia, and how do these tax incentives how are they integrated with other areas of financing, thematic bonds, concessions, etc.? Please, Alejandro, go ahead. Thank you very much. A pleasure. My name is Alejandro. A pleasure. And the idea is to explain a little bit regarding the context of what we've been doing in terms of national strategy for financing in climate. So this is a roadmap that has defined lines of work, amongst which you have design of economic and financial instruments, and that's where we can kick off the conversation. And so what we're looking here is trying to identify possible resources to adapt methodologies that already exist in order to mobilize effectively those resources, meaning that we're talking about credits, but we're also talking about green credits, green sovereign bonds. We're talking about topics in financial derivatives and conversations on swaps, and how can we enable public policies to be able to work with concessions or APPs, as you mentioned, but in order to have alignments and of an infrastructure, and what do we need exactly in order to be able to mobilize those resources? So there are some instruments that we have already been working on, but how to give it an overview on climate objectives. Example, the topic on Green Climate Fund gives us new proposals on blended finance to see how do we find instruments of debt and equity that we can deep dive into. So I wanted to start off from saying what are we doing from the Ministry of Finance and green sovereign bonds, but in order to continue creating these debt emissions, we need to find the projects, and that is one of the greatest challenges we have. So the instrument per se, we don't have a great difficulty that the Ministry of Finance should develop it, because the financial institutions are way more enabled for this in these topics. But the problem is to find the projects that truly respond to the impact that needs to be generated, so that the institutional investors or investors that are going to bring forth the capital to this country, so that we can include it within the national treasury, we can adhere to the needs of climate change. So this is one of the instruments. And so when we are going to go back to the adaptation of climate change, we are looking into the roles of each and every one of the stakeholders. Where can the public sector and the private sector participate, and what are their roles? Because one of the difficulties is that these projects do not have the feasibility. So where is the business case of the models of adaptation, so that the private sector can truly be incentivized? So of course we need to work from the public sector in order to manage enabling mechanisms. So in Colombia we have something very interesting, which means work on tax works. And so they have a concession of 50% of the tax due to adaptation services, or on environmental issues, when they're working on environmental issues, or to better generate the environment with infrastructure. So this is an incentive, because it doesn't generate an additional tax in order to do green works. And so a percentage of this is going to be destined to a project of adaptation. So I feel that this is a very clear strategy as to how the private sector is being incentivized. There is a tax incentive on behalf of the state, but we need to see how to involve the private sector in order to finance topics related to adaptation. And so yesterday they were talking about the language, and we need to reform the language in which we speak to the private sector in general. And if we don't talk about the importance of climate change and adaptation to climate change, and how can they reduce their vulnerability, then let's talk about cash flow. And so you have the agreement of Monte Carlo, where you can see what is the probability of loss that you can have within the cash flow. What is the exit that the cash flow is having due to exposure to risk, for example, which is derived from one of the physical risks. So if we do a sort of sensitivity analysis where regarding the cash flow, then maybe we can identify what are the variabilities of the business model that are most exposed to a possible risk. And so it is also key to understand what are the reductions of the cost and the possible losses that have been saved by the companies in their cash flow, in order to continue mobilizing resources in terms of adaptation. And so basically, in order to work on these two topics, and then the third one, which is very interesting for me, is the topic on creating parameters under some. This is the creation of specific parameters that occur because of climate. So you've been working on for example, we've been working on the pilot. We have, based on the topic, we have some people who are cooperating, but in order to work on the parameters of insurance, we need more information. And we have a whole a chain of components that is important in order to deep dive into a good finance instrument that manages climate change issues. And so the second issue is that if we don't have a meteorological instrument that will tell us if there will be rains, and all of the issues that may be having, for example, a zone where you have where you can cultivate coffee, for example, for the insurance to be. The same thing happens with the bonds. We need very good projects in order to mobilize effectively the investors, institutional investors. We're talking about a blended finance. This is exactly another one of the strategies that we have, and this is precisely what we've been doing before. The multilateral bank already knows it, and the multilateral bank already knows that the IBD CAF generates a series of resources with rates and a benefit with rates. You pass it to the development bank, and it continues happening, and so therefore they end up having a lower rate than the market. But we continue with these inconveniences. So what is the inconvenience? It is to generate a greater flow of financial resources. Therefore, it is very important to identify what are the new strategies. So now the discourse is the debt swaps, which are the swaps of debt when we have to basically swap a debt, and with the debtor and the creditor, in order to reduce the interest rate, or if we have a full cancellation of the debt, where we can use these resources for the financing of policies of conservation. And so we also need to be very careful with these debt with these debt reductions, because it is a very sensitive topic where we need to have a technical liability of feasibility, with many steps in order to define these steps and know what are the projects that are going to be financed and how are you going to develop the funds that is going to administer um, or the trust that is going to actually finance the debt of the country. So this is one of the instruments of financing that is being generated. And so maybe we can deep down in the we can deep dive in the conversation in the next questions. Thank you so much, Alejandro. Excellent. The pipeline on projects, I think, along with the blended finance, we can attack those or tackle those topics. We have to talk about blended finance with local finance systems. When you're talking about Latin American, Caribbean, mainly Latin America, the public banking is a crucial stakeholder in order to channelize concession in order to create concessional funds and to create enabling conditions, and the public-private sector in order to create pipelines of projects. Now, Alejandro also spoke about models of business, of risking, and to see how can we reduce the risk with public policies, transfer the risk from the private sector to the public sector with mechanisms of insurance, of funds of credit guarantee, and also multilateral agreements and compensation with fiscal compensation. So well, and he also spoke about debt swaps. So
Beverly is the director of the Blue Bonds and Project Finance Unit in the Office of the Prime Minister in Belize. She is directly responsible for the implementation of the Blue Law and Conservation Funding Agreements and the coordination across government and non-government actors and sectors in the delivery of the key marine conservation targets and commitments. Beverly has played a leadership role in the establishment of protected areas, and also worked with blended finance approach for conservation and ecosystems. So Beverly, welcome, and what's the role, in your opinion, of blue bonds in Belize's climate finance strategy? How will this mechanism help Belize meet its NDC's targets? And also, what's the role of blended finance for nature conservation? Beverly, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First, I'd like to say it's an honor to be here as a part of the distinguished panel and to talk about a topic that is, as we've all recognized today, it's one of the most talked about topic because we're trying to find new ways, unlocking new ways to fill this finance gap that we have in our countries, especially for countries like the LAC countries, and in Belize in particular. When you have a small economy like Belize, where 50% of its GDP is dependent on nature, then this is not an option for us. We have to find solutions for financing nature. So Belize, also like a lot of the developing countries, in 2019 was a very debt-burdened country. It was a country at that time, even before the COVID pandemic, it was suffering from being very burdened by national debt. In 2019, our debt per GDP ratio was 133%. And so addressing debt was a priority for the government. We identified our international commercial debt as a priority for us because it was our most expensive debt. And we were looking at ways to know how to restructure that. We had already kicked the can down the road a couple times already, and we are already looking to approach our then bondholders in terms of now discussing not being able to deliver on our obligations of that existing debt. And so one of the things that Belize did was to now look at a couple of things. There was the issue of zero fiscal space in a country to even invest in nature. But we had some positive things going our way. We had a long history and tradition of good environmental stewardship. We had a good track record in terms of delivering on ambitions. And I think that's one of the things I want to highlight today. I was highlighted earlier by the representative from the World Bank, is that one of the assets that we have in our countries is nature, and we have to start valuing that nature and leveraging that value. It's not just about locking off areas and saying we're conserving these areas, but what exactly does that mean? How does that translate to economic growth, to national development? What's the value of the good things that you're doing in terms of climate change, in terms of meeting ambitions, in terms of contributing to the global ambitions also? And so Belize was able to leverage that history, as I said, of good environmental stewardship to then invest in natural capital. And in the case of the Blue Bond, we were able to, along with strategic partners like TNC, to now attract new bondholders with a better financial plan, which allowed us to pay off that debt at the time, allowed us to now enter into a new financial deal, which gave us the fiscal space in terms of reduction in debt stock, but also reduction in debt servicing. And we were able to now accompany the Blue Loan agreement with a conservation funding agreement, which from the savings that the deal brought about to Belize, Belize was able to establish long-term financing for marine conservation and responsible blue economic growth. So I think that, so that's the first thing. So with that, the conservation funding agreement, the Blue Loan agreement is actually contingent on the delivery of key conservation milestones and conservation targets. And within those targets and milestones are areas for supporting our blue NDCs. And I think that's another thing that we should highlight also. And again, the World Bank representative mentioned it when she said that each country has different considerations and different priority areas. And it's important that the ambitions that are built into these financial deals are organic and that they're really homegrown at the end of the day, because the deals are excellent in that you're now incorporating these ambitions into a financial contract. And so in terms of compliance and delivery, it kind of promotes better delivery on them. But we also have to make sure that what is being delivered is very much a part of national priority, national direction, and national policy. And that is where that framework is very important. And so the Blue Bonds is expected to deliver on key areas that the government of Belize identified as priority areas for them. One was to deliver on a marine spatial plan, which was building already on the work that we've been doing for some years in coastal zone management, integrated coastal zone management in Belize, but to extend it further to our entire blue space. And the second thing was to look at our network of marine protected areas and to say, how important are these in terms of now developing that blue space, especially given the establishment of a Ministry of Blue Economy in Belize. And to date, Belize has 20% of its total ocean space protected. And so it's a matter of us now continuing that planning, that informed planning, both from a biodiversity standpoint, but also from a development standpoint, in terms of saying this is what that blue space should look like, and this is how we're going to deliver on that. And that includes our nature-based objectives and ambitions, and it includes our objectives in terms of moving towards a nature-positive economy. The other thing that I wanted to quickly mention was that the success of our blue bonds now have created a certain level of readiness within the government of Belize to now look at new opportunities, to look at new potentials. These deals are complex. There's nothing simple about these deals. And I think that we talk about them a lot and people think, oh, okay, they're pretty simple and straightforward, but they're far from being simple. And there's a certain level of absorptive capacity and readiness that is needed within countries. And I think that the partnership, the strategic partnership with the MDBs and also with institutions that are able to help put these deals together and also de-risk the deals are very important. What we have now been doing in Belize is we're working along with the IDB to now look at the development of kind of like a menu of KPIs that would be ready for the government of Belize to now look at incorporation in potentially new deals, potentially new financial mechanisms, but also to identify the necessary MRV requirements for that. It's not just a matter of incorporating these KPIs in these deals, but it's to deliver on them at the end of the day and to ensure that there's the capacity within country to do that. And so that is very important for us. Currently, as I said, we have now been able to leverage the success of our Blue Bond to now co-designing a project for finance permanence project for our marine and coastal areas in Belize, which is meant to strengthen, build on what we were achieving with the Blue Bond, but to go a step further and to further incorporate into it more delivery on those NDCs and our ambitions as it relates to nature and climate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Beverly. It was quite interesting to learn from you on the debt arena, how to deal with debt challenge, in the structure, innovative debt strategies to, as you mentioned, to leverage this valuable asset that's a natural capital, and key information on blue loans and bonds, KPIs, and MRV. Thank you so much, Beverly. Y bueno, ahora nos movemos.
Moving on then to our next presenter, Karina Barrera, Undersecretary of Climate Change from the Ministry of Environment, Water and Ecological Transition in Ecuador. Karina has experience in socio-environmental topics on the private risk management of projects and on the private sector and adaptation projects to climate change with indigenous communities in Amazonia. She has held public office and in the Ministry of the Environment of Ecuador. Okay, Karina, when we think of Ecuador, we think of this role of leadership and innovation in the country on bioeconomy area and finance for nature in the Amazonia region, which is an extremely challenging area. We're talking about projects, how to catalyze investment in Amazonia, which is a priority for almost every actor on the multilateral side of the region. Karina, how is Ecuador integrating into bioeconomy, into nature, in their financing strategy for climate, and what's the role of the private sector in this process? Karina, you have the floor, and welcome. Thank you for the opportunity to be able to share experiences of Ecuador in this space. Well, I think there are many things that we need to point out, and climate financing is dispersed. Financing for conservation is dispersed. We have many actors trying to contribute to save Amazonia, but we forget on national priorities at times and national policies and what we want to do. So one of the main challenges is to be able to align resources towards objectives that we want to foster. I want to highlight this because there is a Council of Ministries looking at different investments from different experiences right now, and what's happening today is some sort of a response to international conventions or local mandates, forgetting sometimes which are the aims and challenges that each country faces. And I want to highlight that as a background before I begin talking about financial mechanisms, because we know there's money, but the money doesn't go to where it should. There are projects and programs that are being driven forward, but the idea is to have national policies that are clear, that have clear objectives and targets that can align the many different investment flows that can be available. In that sense, I like to talk about a general scenario. In Amazonia, Ecuador has many innovative projects that have been successful elsewhere that we want to replicate in Amazonia. For example, debt trade, $1,100 million for Galapagos were reconverted in a 600 million debt with a fund of 400 million, creating the Galapagos Life Fund, having a portfolio of projects, leveraging the conservation of Galapagos with a clear management plan, with many different challenges that our region has. And we have learned during the process, and the first challenge is to have a replicable model for Amazonia, but we need to establish the objective of conservation and the destiny of conservation of resources. In Galapagos was for the Hermandad Reserva, and in Amazonia we are building an ecological bio corridor, the largest one in Amazonia, and the president signed executive decree to create this biological corridor, and there's a transition between the authorities to create the management mechanisms. So before we ask about financing, we must have clarity on the what and the why it's being built up. So the financing mechanism is important, leveraging on processes for the conservation of biodiversity. And these participation processes is critical. You're dealing with indigenous peoples and local communities, recognizing that this is important. So the mechanism under construction today needs a dialogue process that has already begun, and it must be stronger. An action axis relevant to climate change is the fight against deforestation. So again, I say we need clarity for the to what. And for Ecuador, we conserve 57% of our native forest, and 84 of these are in Amazonia. The deforestation drivers are coffee, cacao, palm oil, and mining. And we have, cattle growing. And our action plan, Red Mass, is national. It's not split up into projects, but it has guided many actions against deforestation, and it's the strategy that contributes to our NDC. And we try to align this instruments, and the action plan is not only focused on emissions, but it's in diversity, the ancestral knowledge conservation, and being able to potentiate solidarity, popular economy, and water. So we have tried to look at an action plan which is holistic, trying to complement these management and conservation strategies. What's happening today with this mechanism of debt swap? It has a process, and we know that there are many actions that we still have to comply with in order to convert this conservation mechanism in a financial mechanism of debt swap. This is one of the ones that can be potentiated. The other one, Red Más, because historically this has been one of the processes trying to leverage funds in which we have believed for many years now. Ecuador has been believing this since 2009. Since 2013, been working on this system, getting funds through Red Más for deforestation. So we were the second country in the world to pay against outcomes for the reduction of deforestation. Now we hear there's no money, no more funds for this, so we have to create other mechanisms. So we're working on these alternate mechanisms like the LEAP coalition is offering. We are doing carbon mechanisms. We are one of the first 5 countries in the world trying to implement these mechanisms. We have faced a lot of barriers related to financing. These are technological, also of capacities, but we're already working in being able to establish a distribution of benefits plan working with indigenous peoples, and that way we can have new financing access for Amazonia, and it's going to work towards the economies. In this strategy of fighting deforestation, it's important to see that bioeconomy is part of this strategy. If we think that bioeconomy comes to life and becomes a strategy on its own, then again we will be splitting up available financing. So we try to align our country strategies in one common thread. We try, but the different financing mechanisms try to disalign us because they say this is allocated for forests, this is allocated for biodiversity, etc. So the challenge and the main message I want to drive here, different financiers with different mechanisms need to become aligned with our policies, and us public policy generators must have clarity as which is the guiding thread that can help building up the rest of the policies. Otherwise, all the money out there for Amazonia will not have the impact that we want. We have many important things going on. Ecuador has been able to study 7 typical products from Amazonia that can strengthen these social processes and economic processes. We're talking about Distingo, Lurete, and other products that we are pushing forward. We have studied during 7 years these products, understanding which are the value chains that can work, also connecting markets. One of the main weaknesses is not the work in the territory, it's to actually to find the market who will pay more for the leading products fighting deforestation coming from Amazonia. This meant working very hard with the agricultural sector and the agricultural minister. We have now the first label free of deforestation certification. We're the first ones. I think Costa Rica is also working on that. And this distinction recognizes farmers who have conserved their forest and done good practices in their crops. We have been able to export cacao and coffee that are free of deforestation. And so these business agreements begin applying value not only to this production free of deforestation, but those who comply with European norms, but also that it drive forward our own policies, our own fight against deforestation, because it is our country's forests, the ones that are being lost. It's not the European Union that is going to help with that. It should be our own initiatives, the ones that we need to finance, and we have to distinguish and recognize with fiscal incentives these effective practices. So these systems of deforestation-free productive methods are key, but we need to strengthen the capacities of producers, including indigenous peoples, recognizing their ancestral knowledge, and this requires implementation, that everything is being taught through training and education, where to implement, for example, when we cattle growing free of deforestation practices, and I tell, for example, how to do live fencing so that we don't increase deforestation, and how do you implement pastures for cattle. Is international financing coming to this? No, but this is where microfinance comes in. How do we use microfinance to have a positive impact in national policies? The role of microfinance for territorial work is key when you're fighting deforestation. We created the first credit, and this was an innovative practice through one of our flagship programs in Amazonia with the help of UNDP. The first credit for deforestation-free production. We aligned this to national credit. We create incentives so that this promotes practices, including public policy, and they can have more access to these lines of credit. So I repeat again, this group of actions must be must be aligned and guided towards public policies. And this red mass conducting thread has allowed that all of these initiatives are joined in the main objective, and then they come full circle, because this reduction of deforestation will bring payment for outcomes of a lack of deforestation, and we reinvest. Ideally, we should be able to do it, but we face still a lack of alignment from different sectors of international cooperation and financing entities, because we have a lot of credit to finance some things that are not green. And before we fight deforestation, they are promoting deforestation. So Amazonia is always facing a lot of challenges. And to conclude, we're also facing a lot of financing that is going towards the indigenous peoples, but doesn't close the gaps of development of indigenous peoples that have within the framework of creating livelihoods as a means of fighting deforestation. There are a lot of successful examples. How do we measure success? Are we reducing deforestation? Are we improving livelihood? Are we closing the gaps of sustainable development? Success should be measured by key KPIs to measure these results. Thank you.
¿Escucha? Ok, mejor ahora. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you so much, Karina. Spectacular examples. Deep swap with nature in Galapagos with the Conservation Fund, and also payment by outcomes using KPI to finance, and all this big challenge on bioeconomy in Amazonia, and the need to coordinate. When we're talking about Amazonia, we need to coordinate at every level, creating solutions. Otherwise, we will not have full-hearted solutions. I have worked for 3 years in Amazonia, but we need technical assistance in this area. We need to bring funding and work with microfinance and trading finance. That was very good. And finally, what you mentioned, this focus of sustainability, that's really important. This focus is very important when you're analyzing investment in Amazonia as an economy. You have to analyze climate impact, mitigation and adaptation, gender, financial structure, and governance. So thank you, Karina. And let's move on then.
Vamos acá con
We have Sandra Guzman, Luna, founding director and general manager of the Financial Climatic Group for Latin America and the Caribbean. She was before General Director of Policies on Climate Change in the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources from Mexico, Semarnat, and the first Mexican woman on the project that visited Antarctic to witness climate change impact. In 2018, she was declared by Marie Claire the most influential, and 34 angels for climate change on scholarships from the UK. Sandra, welcome. What role can organizations of civil society can carry out in academia on regional initiatives to be able to leverage climate financing in Latin America and the Caribbean? Please, Sandra, welcome. You have the floor. Thank you, Carlos, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this extremely important conversation. It's a pleasure to share with Karina, Alejandro, and Beverly this space, and in particular to be able to exchange the vision. The title of this panel is How Can We Help to Change the Perspective of the Economy as a Whole? And to that end, what we have to do is basically we have to tear apart these conducting threats that Karina was mentioning, and I'm in full agreement. How do we narrow the mechanisms to complete the vision of climate change with nature protection and protection of health and a relevant topic, developing countries? How do we make this financing actually help close gaps of inequality and extreme poverty to which our countries are subjected? Differently from developed countries, to us, successful indicators is just not reducing emissions. That's critical, important, and we have to do it. But we also have to think how we're going to be working with schemes that allow us to take care of those needs at the base. Of course, we have a lot of challenges, and one of the biggest ones in Latin American countries is that if we think jointly, our economies are still dependent on extraction activities, be it fossil fuels or mining, just to create income. On the Index of Sustainable Finance that we created just last year, the 20 most industrialized countries in the region receive 15 times more incomes from carbon-intensive activities as opposed to others like sustainable income to fight climate change. So this is a perverse incentive, making our countries invest 31 times more on the production of fossil fuels than taking care of climate change. This brings us that we have to fight a problem in two levels. Internationally, it's very important to change the structure of the international finance system. These institutions like World Bank, IMF, that were created in a post-war reconstruction context, today cannot really respond to the needs of our countries, especially to respond at the speed we need for transformation. Because this is not only to provide financing. Let's remember the aim of the $100 billion from developed to less developed countries. That hasn't been complied with. But we have a bigger problem. This is structural. How do we have financial mechanisms that don't increase like now it is happening countries' debt? And when we're talking about current mechanisms like canceling debt or swaps, which were mentioned, it's also important that these are mechanisms that will help us treat the debt in the short term. But how are we going to change financial institutions so that these mechanisms are not perpetual in time, because we cannot be swapping all the time?
La reforma del sector financiero y la incorporación de cambio climático y la incorporación de la pérdida de la biodiversidad y todos estos problemas van a ser internalizados por las estructuras del sector financiero, no solo internacional, sino también
not just internationally speaking, but also nationally speaking. And one aspect about the international part also has to do with how are we going to achieve the financial system, design a new goal for a financial system, which is what we're discussing in the Climate Change Convention. And something very important is how are we going to connect these financial mechanisms with the needs of the countries. Let's remember that the new goal of finance, the new quantifiable goal that is being discussed to be approved next year has a very important element which says you need to consider the needs of the developing countries, as Karina mentioned, and and the great question is how much do we need in order to combat climate change, not how much does the implementation of NDCs cost, rather how much does the adaptation plan cost, and how are we going to achieve then mechanism designs that are going to really attend to the needs, and this is not going to convert into, whatever have available is for adaptation and what you maybe need is protection for biodiversity. That connection is critical. So now, at national level, we have a lot of work to do because we're talking about the entire cycle of finances, not just about being able to access this international finance, which is very important, but also if we were to receive the entire international financing, but we do not change the structure of the public finances of our countries, we are not going to get out of this vicious cycle. So from the income standpoint, it is very important to reduce the subsidies to fossil fuels gradually, structurally, but yes, it is important to stop leaving those incentives to activities that are stopping the incentives to those activities that are generating all these problems. Yes, we're also talking about fiscal or tax reforms, and we're talking about these carbon taxes and taxes to contamination, but it is important to know how to achieve the resources that are collected should be allocated to the transitions, should be allocated to those transformative changes, and so that they can reflect the real value, because the taxes currently in our country, those that are implemented in Latin America, are smaller in terms of contamination of the sectors that are paying those taxes. And it is very important as well to talk about the generation of incentives in order to for technological improvements in the region. I mean, I think Karina was also saying that we can't just simply adopt technologies of other countries. How do we drive the technological development that will allow us to transit to new economies? Bioeconomy is a great opportunity, and Beverly was also mentioning it. What do we do so that what we most have, which is nature and the great biodiversity in the region, which, by the way, we are losing very quickly from 1990 to 2020, we have moved from 56% to 43% of forest area in the region, and so we're losing that eco capital at very, very accelerated steps. And so we're not only talking about income but also the expenditure. How much are we spending? It is very important to do this analysis as to how to integrate the perspective of climate change within the expenses of the country, not just the environmental expenses, where normally we've seen the perspective of climate change. How is the energy sector spending, the energy sector, the agricultural, the cattle raising sector? And it is not just more budget, but a better budget, allocation of resources, identifying what are the programs that are generating these disparities and also achieving those incentives. And this has a lot to do with, and I enjoy the creation of this work with finance ministers, which is a very important table, but also it is important that the finance minister work hand in hand with the ministers of environment. And so we generate a platform with the environment, but then another platform with finance, and then they stop talking amongst each other, and then that also generates, practically speaking, and in terms of implementation, we have a gap that needs to be covered. And so in terms of private sector, that needs to, which is a very important mechanism. I mean, we need to mobilize the private sector, but that doesn't mean that the public sector is less important. I mean, the public sector is the one that traces the messages so that the other sector participates. And therefore, it is very important that this trend that we have of generating taxonomies in order to incentivize the private sector needs to better characterize their investments, and that is very important. So we need need to observe it and regulate it at the same time. It is not enough with the voluntary initiatives, because we've already seen that the voluntary schemes are not always the ones that are most effective. And here we're talking about a deeper transformation that only generates obligations. And so, therefore, you generate sanctions to not creating any action, and this is the only way that we can accelerate these works. Having said that, the organizations of civil society from the academia, what we're doing is being able to analyze, we are the historical memory of the political processes of the country, analyze how the evolution has been given, where are the gaps, where are the great opportunities, and thus achieve that these transformations should be truly precisely that. It should be structural. Work with the organizations, work with communities, which are people who are generating this knowledge that can help. Remember that the countries and governments keep changing. Governments change all the time. And with that, the priorities change. And when these priorities are not destined to climate change, then they go back. They have a step back. They have a setback, which is exactly what we're seeing. And so that's where, as an organization, as non-governmental entity, should head in order to go forward in the process of transformation, because this is not a struggle only for the governments. This is a struggle where everybody will have to work together, and that is a role that we see through the organizations of civil society, but also from private organizations and others that are covering those laggings that the government is not going to be able to cover, because we know and understand that the capacity is limited at the time of implementation. So some of the elements that I'm leaving here for conversation, a lot of topics in relation to transparency that we need to work on, but I am very happy to be able to have a conversation with colleagues. Thank you so much. So good that I called you Sonia and not Sandra. Well, this panel is truly spectacular. We have spoken about topics in relation to the need to be able to restructure financial instruments and just debt strategies. So the reform to fossil fuels is essential, and how to redirect that to green investments, which has happened in the case of Uruguay in their transportation. And also UNDP is launching publications, in the sense that very soon we are going to launch. And well, the topic on private sector and public sector, the role of the public sector here, how do we what do we do in order to increase the private investment and incentives, and how, along with the combination of public and private funds, the APPA, the Public and Private Association concessions, etc., and finally mechanisms of coordination of bottom-up are essential. So I'm going to thank the panelists. And now the idea is to move forward and receive questions and create dialogue. And I am going to invite the public. It is very important if you have any questions, and discuss options. Hello, how are you? Good morning. I am very thankful with the panel. I mean, it was incredible. Concern that I have is, well, I have been following this issue in relation to transformation. How do you generate financial instruments for mitigation and adaptation to climate change through different instruments, through carbon prices, carbon taxes, amongst other measures? However, something that I have seen repeatedly is, not just in Mexico, but many other instruments that have been presented throughout this week, is the enormous lack of clarity, and how are the mechanisms of transparency and accountability going to be managed, of resources that are directed. I mean, many of the conversations in terms of carbon pricing and taxes is like, oh yeah, since this market has increased in Latin America and Mexico, we are doing this in the state, and this is going to help with climate change, whatnot. And In none of the conversations do you mention how is this money going to be allocated to the projects that Sandra mentioned. It's not only about that, but also we lack the institutionalization. I mean, there are words of goodwill as to how the citizens will actually know that this is truly happening. And so I wanted to ask, deep diving into my question now, if you know whether at this moment you can surely say whether in some place there already is a good practice of transparency and accountability where the states are saying, yes, I mean, we're raising all this money, we're raising all this financial flow, and we're generating these results. Because otherwise, it just looks like just one more mechanism in order to pull money and place it within the hands of who knows who in order to benefit who knows who, and who knows what will happen. So thank you so much. So thank you very much. We can collect 2 to 3 questions. I mean, we have the colleague there. Thank you very much. Well, a question for Subsecretary Karina. I'm going to ask you a very particular question to what Alejandro mentioned. What are the numbers of the funds for Galapagos in terms of accountability, feasibility? How can other investments be directed to these specialized funds? I mean, how other investors can come in other than the public issue and blended capital, as we mentioned? What are the feasibilities? What are the rates? What are the numbers that are managed in these specialized funds? That's one question. And Alejandro, what to do in order to talk the same language in terms of environment and to manage the financial structures in Colombia, because you have the green taxonomy that is participating with World Bank, but there is a huge disconnection. And I think it goes by what you just said. What is the feasibility of this intensive forage in terms of because there's a big gap between first and second floor. Thank you. Well, one last question from the colleague. We have 3 questions now. Hello, Adriana Basam from CCAP. This is a question for the National Department of Planning. You spoke about many financial instruments that are being visualized for Colombia. However, we know that the administrations have a limitation in terms of time to be able to develop these type of instruments, and the instruments take many years and a learning curve in order to know them. So I would like to know, what would you mention as top 2 of the financial instruments that Colombia at this time is targeting for and betting on for the coming years? Very concrete examples, just like Belize and Ecuador. But I would like to know, of all of those you mentioned, which is the first or top 2? There are more online questions. Perfect. How do we manage that? Let's begin with these and then we continue with online questions. Well, here the boss is Laura. I need to manage the time well and the structure, otherwise I'm going to have serious problems. All right, so let's start with the first question. I am going to pass this question to Sandra. Our question of mechanisms of transparency and accountability. Sandra. Thank you very much. You are making me deep dive in a point that I wasn't able to. And so it is very important, and a very important objective of the Paris Agreement of 2.1c, which needs to be which says that the financial objectives need to be consistent with climate issues. Public or private funds, all of that need to be aligned, which means that all of the countries need to make an effort in order to reach there. And the only way to be able to make sure that we're reaching there is to have mechanisms of transparency that allows us to understand where are we, where do we want to go, and what is the gap that we want to cover. Unfortunately, unfortunately, at international level, there is no international mechanism of transparency that allows us to do that monitoring. However, Article 13 of the Paris Agreement speak about the Paris Agreement that needs to be institutionalized at national level, and this is a process that national level needs to do. How the countries make a report of the resources that they receive, and also, therefore, a lot of the data that we channelize, the majority come from the donors, those who give financing, and very little information can be seen in coordination and systemized from top to bottom. I mean, they need to make their efforts too. And I want to highlight an example of a mechanism that's trying to do this, which is precisely the MRD of Colombia. Then maybe Alejandro can deep dive into that, and they can analyze what is the financing not only for international cooperation but also from public budget. As LAC head of LAC, we had the honor of supporting in that, and also to understand and to what point of financing for adaptation reaches the most vulnerable zones, and then to create a better connection in order to have an analysis of effectiveness. But this exercise is unique in Colombia. Maybe other countries in the region are moving to a transition as such, but we do have a huge gap, and I might even say that it is international. We don't know how much of the finance that has been moved. I mean, $600 million annually have been moved is what is the number that's been said around, but we don't know how much of that reduced vulnerability. We don't have that data. In conclusion, I have to say that there is a great opportunity called the Agreement of Escazú. Many people relate it to climate defenders and climate justice and environmental justice, but we have information which is the most important right to citizenship. We need to see where are the resources spent, how is the money what is the flow of money, and the Escazú is a great tool for the citizenship in order to take better decisions around the region. Thank you very much, Sandra. Now I'm going to pass the word to Karina or Alejandro. So Alejandro, please, if you can go for the question in terms of specific financial instruments for Colombia. It was just to complement this question. They were talking about the transparency framework. And taking advantage of the fact that you're with a microphone, if you could please answer our colleagues on Colombia. Thank you. Well then, effectively, as Sandra was mentioning just now, Colombia has a system of monitoring of report and verification, which is a system that manages to highlight what are the public and private and corporation resources through different sources of information. So for public sources, we have a app called QuickBook, and we have then the presidential area of cooperation, which is called Ciclope. And for private resources, we do it through the industrial and environmental national statistic. And so this is how we are capturing the information and evidencing what are the resources that are being mobilized. It is, but it is not a perfect model. It is an estimate, a sample that we are seeing of the resources that are being generated and mobilized in the country, but we need to be improving the sources of information, meaning that the private sector, maybe our source of information may not just be it can also be with the financial sector, and this implies that the financial institutions need to have real commitments in order to indicate what are the amounts that are being mobilized for each and every one of the green instruments. We're doing this through the National Development Bank, which is a public bank, which is the FDN, who has public and private participation, but our four development banks are reporting the resources that are moving in climate change. So that is an exercise that we have, and as a good practice, which is exactly what you were asking. And another good practice is budget tracers, which allow us to trace the budget for environment, climate change, and to understand how are the investments being allocated in public aspects, and that is another good practice in the country. And then in terms of private sector, they were mentioning the green taxonomy, and it is this is the environment technical, or to reduce the possible greenwashing that can have financial taxonomy in this subject, aligned with that is involved by different financial institutions, meaning that there are different you have the carbon disclosure project, which is also, and this is precisely given by the private sector, where practically they are advancing with CDP in order to have an memorandum of understanding, to understand what are the advancements of private sector in this aspect, and only to understand explain the good practices in terms of transparency. This is some of the things that have been done. Thank you very much, Alejandro. So we're also another topic of Galapagos as to how to contribute to other funds of structures of finance mechanisms. Karina, you have the floor. Well, a very specific question in regards to what is the feasibility that can exist in this type of project is not necessarily something I can answer today. Rather, what is the mechanism that exists? In this mechanism, there are $400 million that are going to be given out in a non-exchange, that has a umbrella of 16 million annually, and Galapagos Life Fund. And where can you invest in the private sector here? I think this is a very important opportunity, because this can only be financed with the capital of Galapagos Life Fund. This is a base capital with private capital that works to generate an impact project. This is an important opportunity to multiply the investment that is sustained on this seed capital, if we can call it like that. And the lines of action and the fund governance are already defined. They are in a process of instrumentation and in the accountability, because there is a directive committee in terms of and along with multi-institutional observers. We're not just talking about government entities, but many entities and subnational governments in Galapagos. This is important, but part of the progress that we're doing as part of the financing in terms of blended finance. In the case of Ecuador, we have implemented with Galapagos a finance of 117 million with GCF, and there is an implementation for the project of Conolopus, which is a project, photovoltaic project. And so they acquired this loan with at a preferential rate. And we are talking about a preferential rate of 2 and 5%. And the banking sector also benefits with this, because you have $10 million that are linked with CAF to be able to establish microcredited lines of credit for the energy transformation, which is linked to this great transformation we want to do. And so many sources of financing are open, and once we have this low cost credit, and on the other hand to do these investments to projects that already have a seed capital in order for it to multiply. Thank you. Thank you very much, Karina. And Sandra wants to compliment, right? Hello. Well, just to share 2 tools of transparency where we have developed an index of sustainable finance where we manage these We're very happy to share this information in order to see exactly where we are headed, and in collaboration with our colleague from CCAP, we're doing this observation in taxonomy, which has the monitoring of citizenship to see how are we going to see so that the implementation be effective, and welcome those who are interested in any of the two exercises. Thank you so much. And well, I am under pressure here because I am going to apologize. As you mentioned earlier, I may have serious problems, and we may not be able to bring forth more questions because this panel was extremely spectacular. I mean, if you have any questions or concerns that we're leading the global level financing, then it is very clear in this panel that there is no doubt. Latin America and the Caribbean, in the Latin America and the Caribbean, we are leaders and we are innovating. We have mentioned what Svetlana said at the very beginning. I mean, we're leading, but it is necessary what has been mentioned by the colleague of Elise. We need to prepare the strategy and the framework, national integrated frameworks that are national and specific to the needs of every country, etc. And here we may have differentiated financial strategies. And here we have spoken about strategies of debt instruments, and as just like the blue bonds. We're talking about topics in relation to innovation with bonds that are linked to sustainability-linked bonds, and the specific KPIs for this, and also the role of blended finance in order to bring forth and leverage that private investment. I think this is a topic that we can still work on very much in the region. And I think we can actually talk about blended financing on many levels. And I think at national level, working with the National Development Bank and innovative mechanisms in capital markets can be very interesting. And also then we're talking about de-risking, the importance of mechanisms of risk mitigation or de-risking in order to reduce the risk with policies and in the private sector to the public sector, and creating financial incentives. And also finally the spectacular work with microfinances, work for environmental services, carbon finance. And of course, we've also spoken about structural topics of the global finance aspects, which is necessary for the restructuring of the national system in order to have more sustainable mechanisms for debt based on every country. And finally, topics in relation to coordination, transparency, and accountability. All of the focus of how to construct mechanisms, financial mechanisms, and innovative mechanisms in order to continue having this innovative perspective and dialogue with the civil society, other organizations, and those who regulate the market, private sectors, and many levels. And they get into the role of different financial regulating aspects that are very much interesting. Clear examples from Brazil that with more than 2,000 participants in financial innovating aspects. And also we have the green financing in the case of Chile, and the green finances of Colombia, etc. So thank you so much. We have on everything we are working and innovating. I am very happy learning a lot in regards to this with the participants. Thank you so much, and see you next year.
Hola, sí, un pequeño anuncio para las personas que están hospedadas en lugares que no son dentro aquí del Marriott. Lo que nos están avisando es que por cuestiones de que están cerrando las calles, están aconsejando a la gente que preferiblemente regrese a sus hoteles, regrese a sus hogares.
And We are going to see how can we transfer all of these sessions that are going to happen today virtually. So no situation is being generated, but we are under alert to see whether there may be roads may be closed that could lead to the hotel. So maybe it would be better to go back to the hotels at this point.